Marcus scoffed, shaking his head as if Snoop's words were nothing more than an amusing joke. He leaned back in his seat, swirling the champagne in his glass before taking a slow sip. "You know," Marcus continued, turning his head slightly toward Snoop, "you talk like someone who's had to justify their place in life more than a few times. Am I right?" Snoop exhaled softly, still unshaken. He rested his arm on the armrest, fingers loosely curled around the bottle of water. "I just don't see the need to prove anything to anyone," he said. "The way I see it, real confidence doesn't need validation." Marcus let out a short laugh. "That's cute, but let's be real here. People judge. That's just how the world works. If you don't show people what you're worth, they'll assume you're worth nothing." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze holding steady. "You ever consider that maybe it's not about what you show, but what you do?" Marcus scoffed again. "Oh, please. That kind of thinking might sound good in a motivational speech, but in the real world, image is everything. The right suit, the right connections, that's what gets you in the door." Snoop let the silence linger for a moment, then simply nodded. "If that's what you believe." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but just then, the flight attendant returned. "Mr. Bennett, would you like anything else?" she asked, her voice perfectly polite, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that suggested she had been listening. He smirked. "Another champagne, please." The flight attendant nodded, then turned to Snoop. "And for you, sir?" Snoop glanced at his nearly full bottle of water, then shook his head. "I'm good, thank you." The flight attendant smiled, then walked away. Marcus, still reveling in his self-perceived dominance, turned back to Snoop. "See, this is what I mean. You're here, but you're not really here. You've got to act like you belong if you want people to take you seriously." Snoop chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I think I'll let my work speak for itself." Marcus raised an eyebrow, still not connecting the dots. "Right. Music, right? Let me guess. Local gigs? Small-time producer? Maybe a DJ at one of those underground places?" Before Snoop could answer, another passenger leaned over from across the aisle, a younger man wearing a casual hoodie and sneakers, his eyes wide with excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, looking directly at Snoop, "but I just have to say, I'm a huge fan. Your music has been such an inspiration to me." Marcus froze. His mind scrambled to process what was happening. The younger man continued, "I remember when Gin and Juice first dropped. Man, that song changed everything for me." Snoop nodded, offering a warm smile. "I appreciate that, man. Means a lot." Marcus's eyes darted between the two, the realization creeping in like a slow-moving storm. He sat up straighter, suddenly very aware of how wrong he had been. The pieces fell into place, and for the first time in the entire interaction, he was speechless. The younger man hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "Would you mind if I got a picture with you?" Snoop gave a small chuckle and nodded. "Of course." As the fan snapped a selfie, Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had spent the entire flight trying to assert his dominance over someone who had already carved out a legacy in the world, a legacy that Marcus had been completely blind to. The fan thanked Snoop again and returned to his seat, leaving Marcus staring at the man beside him with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. Snoop turned his gaze back to Marcus, his expression still calm, still unreadable. "Guess you never know who might show up in first class," he said, echoing Marcus's earlier words. Marcus swallowed hard, his face growing warm. He forced a chuckle, trying to play it off. "Yeah, I guess not." For the rest of the flight, Marcus barely spoke. He sat in silence, his mind replaying the conversation, every arrogant assumption he had made crumbling under the weight of reality. Snoop, on the other hand, remained just as he had been from the start, calm, composed, and entirely at peace with himself. As the plane began its descent, Marcus cleared his throat. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter now, lacking its earlier arrogance. I misjudged you." Snoop turned to him, waiting. Marcus exhaled, then offered a small nod. I respect what you do. Snoop studied him for a moment before giving a slight nod. Appreciate that. No long-winded speeches, no dramatic revelations, just a simple acknowledgement, and somehow that was enough. As they stepped off the plane, Marcus walked with a little less swagger, a little more humility, because in that unexpected encounter, he had learned a lesson far more valuable than any first-class experience could offer. Marcus sank deeper into his seat, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. The name Dog echoed in his mind like a thunderclap, and the weight of his earlier arrogance now felt like a crushing burden. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the subtle smirks and whispered comments from other passengers. Some were clearly amused by the turn of events, while others seemed to pity him. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to dominate conversations, to assert his superiority, but now he felt small, smaller than he ever had in his life. Snoop, on the other hand, remained as calm as ever. He adjusted his sunglasses and leaned back in his seat, his demeanor unshaken. The flight attendant, sensing the tension, offered Marcus a fresh glass of water, but he waved her off, his pride still clinging to him like a tattered cloak. He couldn't bring himself to look at Snoop directly, but he could feel the man's presence, a quiet force that seemed to fill the entire cabin. I didn't mean to disrespect you, Marcus stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who you were. Snoop turned his head slightly, his expression calm but firm. Marcus, it don't matter who I am. What matters is how you carry yourself. You can't go through life trying to prove something to everybody. That ain't living, that's just exhausting. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing too late that the ground beneath him had crumbled away. He had spent his entire life climbing, striving, and pushing to prove his worth, but now he wondered if any of it had been worth it. The silence in the cabin was deafening, and Marcus could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him. The flight attendant returned, this time with a small tray of snacks. She placed it gently on Snoop's tray table, her smile warm and respectful. Mr. Dog, if there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask. Snoop nodded politely. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. As she walked away, Marcus finally found his voice again. Look, I didn't mean to come off like that. I've worked so hard to get where I am. I thought that's what mattered. Snoop took a sip of his water, his gaze steady. Hard work is important, no doubt. But it ain't everything. You gotta remember where you came from, and you gotta remember to treat people right along the way. Otherwise, what's the point? Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He thought about his childhood, growing up in a small town where opportunities were scarce. He thought about the long hours he'd put in, the sacrifices he'd made, and the people he'd stepped on to get to where he was. For the first time, he wondered if it had all been worth it. The cabin remained quiet, the hum of the plane's engines the only sound. Marcus glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by. He felt a strange sense of clarity, as if a fog had lifted. He turned back to Snoop, his voice softer now. You're right. I think I lost sight of what really matters. Snoop gave a small nod, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. It happens to the best of us. The important thing is to recognize it and make it change. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't even know where to start. Snoop leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but firm. Start by being kind. Start by listening more and talking less. And remember, success ain't about what you got. It's about who you are. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment he thought he might cry. But he held it together, nodding slowly. Thank you, he said quietly. I needed to hear that. Snoop leaned back again, a small smile playing on his lips. Anytime, my dude. Life's a journey, and we all gotta learn as we go. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Marcus spent the time reflecting on his life, his choices, and the person he wanted to be. By the time the plane began its descent, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. As the wheels touched down, he turned to Snoop and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I mean it." Snoop shook his hand, his grip firm but friendly. "Take care of yourself, Marcus, and remember, it's never too late to make a change." As they disembarked, Marcus watched Snoop walk away, surrounded by a small group of admirers who had recognized him. For the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel envy or resentment. Instead, he felt gratitude. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. As he walked through the airport, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. When the voice on the other end answered, he smiled. "Hey, Mom, it's me. I just wanted to say, I love you." And for the first time in a long time, Marcus meant it. As Marcus stood in the terminal watching Snoop disappear into the bustling crowd, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The weight of Snoop's words lingered in his mind, like a mirror reflecting parts of himself he had long ignored. For the first time in years, Marcus felt small, not in a degrading way, but in a way that made him realize how much room he had to grow. He took a deep breath, the noise of the airport fading into the background as he replayed the entire encounter in his head. The flight had started like any other. Marcus, dressed in his tailored suit and polished shoes, had boarded with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had always prided himself on his success, his ability to climb the corporate ladder faster than his peers. But now, as he stood there, he couldn't help but wonder if that success had come at the cost of his humanity. Snoop's calm demeanor and unwavering kindness had exposed a side of Marcus he hadn't acknowledged in years, a side that was insecure, judgmental, and desperate to prove his worth. As Marcus made his way through the terminal, he noticed a group of teenagers laughing and taking selfies near a coffee stand. One of them accidentally bumped into him, spilling a bit of their drink on his sleeve. Instinctively, Marcus felt a surge of irritation, but before he could react, he caught himself. He remembered Snoop's words. "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves." Instead of snapping, Marcus forced a smile and said, "No worries, it's just a little coffee. Happens to the best of us." The teenager looked surprised but relieved, offering a quick apology before rejoining their friends. That small interaction felt like a victory. For the first time in a long time, Marcus had chosen kindness over pride. It was a start, but he knew it wasn't enough. He needed to do more, to be more. As he waited for his luggage at the carousel, he pulled out his phone and began typing a note to himself. Apologize to Sarah, call Mom, volunteer somewhere, be better. The list was short, but it felt like a roadmap to a new version of himself. Meanwhile, Snoop's impact continued to ripple far beyond the confines of that airplane. The story of their encounter had gone viral, with passengers sharing their accounts on social media. Hashtags like humility matters and #kindness is key began trending, sparking conversations about the importance of empathy and self-reflection. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, Marcus found himself at the center of a narrative he never expected to be part of. At first, he was hesitant to embrace the attention. He worried that people would see him as the villain of the story, the arrogant businessman who needed a reality check. But as the days passed, he realized that the public's reaction wasn't about shaming him. It was about celebrating growth. People were inspired by his willingness to change, and that gave him the courage to keep moving forward. Marcus reached out to Sarah, his former colleague, whom he had belittled during a meeting months ago. He apologized sincerely, acknowledging his behavior and expressing his regret. To his surprise, Sarah forgave him, and their conversation ended with a promise to collaborate on a project that would benefit their community. He also reconnected with his mother, whom he had been too busy to call regularly. Their conversations became a source of comfort and grounding, reminding him of the values he had once held dear. Inspired by Snoop's example, Marcus began volunteering at a local youth center, mentoring teenagers who were navigating their own challenges. He shared his story openly, emphasizing the importance of humility and self-awareness. The kids, initially skeptical of the well-dressed businessman, soon warmed up to him, finding solace in his honesty and vulnerability. As the months passed, Marcus noticed a shift within himself. The need to prove his worth began to fade, replaced by a genuine desire to contribute to the world around him. He started a foundation focused on empowering underprivileged youth, using his resources and connections to create opportunities for those who needed them most. The foundation's motto, "True success is measured by the lives you touch," became a guiding principle for Marcus and everyone involved. Snoop, too, continued to inspire millions through his music, philanthropy, and unwavering commitment to kindness. When asked about the incident on the flight during an interview, he simply smiled and said, "We all have moments where we need to check ourselves. The real power is in what we do after." His words resonated deeply, reinforcing the message that growth is a lifelong journey. The story of Marcus and Snoop became a modern-day parable, a reminder that no matter how far we stray from our values, it's never too late to find our way back. It taught people that true strength lies in vulnerability, and that the most impactful changes often begin with a single moment of self-reflection. In the end, Marcus didn't just change his own life. He became a catalyst for change in the lives of countless others. And as he stood on the stage at his foundation's first gala, looking out at a room full of people who believed in his mission, he felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. He had finally found what he had been searching for all along: purpose. The world continued to buzz with stories of kindness and redemption, but for Marcus, the most important story was the one he was writing every day. A story of growth, humility, and the power of second chances. And as he closed his eyes that night, he whispered a quiet thank you to the man who had set him on this path. "Thank you, Snoop." The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus was excited to see where it would take him.